Hello, a very warm welcome to Fireside Chats. My name is Magela Pillai, and I'd like to introduce you to the speaker, Sister Denise, who has been practicing Rajyoga Meditation for over 4 decades. Today's topic is entitled Transparency. In this series, we look at what the core of spirituality is. We look at aspects such as philosophical as well as spiritual integrity. We ask you, the viewer, to ask yourself as to whether you enjoy a real and meaningful relationship with God, whomsoever you believe him or her to be. We also ask you to look at your own life and to ask yourself simple questions such as, are you happy? Are you fulfilled? Sister Denise, a very, very warm welcome to today's show, and thank you so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much.
Sister Denise, tell us, transparency, what does it mean to you?
I look at it in terms of a contrast because there are some cultures that give a great deal of importance to what's called confidentiality. Another culture would say secrecy. So the culture that favors transparency considers confidentiality as secrecy. In other words, it's a bad thing. The culture that favors confidentiality will consider the openness and clarity of transparency to be telling things that shouldn't be told, exposing, opening it out for public scrutiny. It's sort of immodest, So it's really an issue of cultural clash, really.
Sister Denise, if I look at the word transparency, the synonyms that come to mind are words like accountability, honesty, integrity, etc. How does it have a bearing on the way we function as an individual to be transparent?
Both of us really come from what's called this Western culture where we give a lot of importance to transparency, accountability, integrity, and so on. These are classified as very, very high values because if there is not transparency, then all sorts of things, corruption, manipulation, hanky-panky, all sorts of things can happen. And then we say, well, then you're not straight, you're not honest, and so that's not good. Go to a different culture where confidentiality is given highest priority, being very discreet, covering other people's reputation and honor and all of that is considered important. And, a person will refuse to apologize or refuse to admit because if they do that, then they'll lose face, and that's worse than anything else. So the problem is really a clash of values. And one of the things that I've become very aware of is that most people think that virtues and values and spirituality is all the same thing, but it really is not. And I see that there's an enormous scope for clash of values between cultures, and this is really a challenge for people to determine what's good, because from one angle it's not good at all, from the other angle is very good, so people don't see eye to eye at all. But there's an assumption among the adherents of transparency that transparency, integrity, accountability, what's wrong with that? And then the other side will say, well, we can't have that, that's too open, that's not proper. And I think it's also connected with the confidentiality side is very much the pyramidal society, the very stratified society where there's not much social mobility, and the transparency is much more democratic, much more flat society, And, both societies exist and they have their own justification, but they can't coexist very easily.
Now, Sister Denise, basic question. To be transparent, is it healthy or not? Should one aspire towards transparency if you're not? As an individual, not as part of an organization, an individual, should one be this way?
I think in some respects, yes, and in some respects, no. There are circumstances where you need to be sort of inaccessible. And then when it comes to something like public trust, there needs to be transparency. When it comes to your boundaries, there may be some people who want to invade your life, and if you're too transparent, then you're very vulnerable. So in that case, your opacity is much better. So I think you have to really see the different circumstances to see where transparency is really applicable and where the opacity is much better.
Is somebody who is transparent, do they earn the trust of others because of their transparency or not?
Well, if you want somebody to trust you, you have to open to them and let them in. And if you keep closed doors and you're not forthcoming, and yet you want them to trust you without letting them in, that's not really reasonable, because they have to have some good reason to trust you, So you have to see circumstance by circumstance, because you can't be totally friendly with everybody all the time. It's not the right thing. There's something to do with decorum. It's like with dress, you wear a dress which is a statement, and the statement is you see the face, you see the hands, I'm not here for you to see any more than that in this body. Then there are other people who dress very differently and they're operating body to body, and that's that currency. If you want to be in a very official capacity, a diplomatic capacity, people have uniforms that correspond to the activity, and the uniform has attributes of the activity that corresponds to the nature of that activity, and so these are kind of messages between people. And I think that there are societies which are very open. There are societies that are very closed, and each one has its own justification. And if you say, okay, well, what I am interested in is spirituality, and I'm distinguishing between spirituality and Puritanism.
Define Puritanism?
Well, Puritanism is like very stiff and closed and rigid, and nothing is permitted, and any kind of frivolity is considered bad. Whereas in spirituality you have this sense of fluidity and naturalness, and you don't want to be tight because that doesn't flow with the flexibility of it. But the Puritan will say, well, this is more, moral. And the spiritual will say, well, this is more real, you see. Try and get a blade of grass to be rigid. It's not natural for it, So a blade of grass is actually sometimes a good analogy for spirituality, because it refers to that flexibility, that ability to, get up even if you've been squashed down, you'll get back up again, you're not bothered by storms and so on, whereas the rigid one is also brittle and easily breaks. So, you know, each one has its own justification, and I suppose in the end what you end up with is what will persist. And so again, I think it is a little bit similar to the subject of what is created by God and what is created by mankind in the name of God, and those two things will be pretty different.
Okay. Sister Denise, I'm glad you brought up God into this subject. Is God transparent? Is God, can one see through God? Don't know how else to phrase that, but can you?
Well, God has nothing to hide, so there's no covering in that sense. But God is always known as mysterious. And so God seems to have this personality and seems to like not being very predictable. So God doesn't like to be able to be read too easily. And I think that that also resonates with people who like God and want to be like God. Yeah, I shouldn't be an open book, you know, you need to go through a few layers before you find me. So I think that God is known for clarity, truth, but at the same time very subtle. And because of that, not so easily accessible to all. So these characteristics of God, I think, will inform the choice of a culture that wants to be as close as possible like God, you know.
Okay, so if one wants to get close to the eternally transparent one, how does one make this journey if he's not easy to read and so heavily disguised, like you stated in a previous episode? How does one get there?
Well, I think for God, there's merit in being able to see through the layers, the veils, and so on. So if there aren't any veils, then everything is it's equally visible to everyone. So there's no merit in being able to get through. And I think that the world is, in a sense, a meritocracy, in a sense. I mean, it's really the word that is used in Brahmakumaris is a sort of an invented word, number-wise.
And what does that mean?
Number-wise means that there's a gradation. There's some people who can really perceive very, very well and see through all of these disguises and veils. And then there's others who just don't have that subtle perception and they can't see anything. So they are, in a sense, less meritorious, less competent, less capable. And this is just the way humanity is. There's a very few who are, you know, really, you say perfect, and very many who are very imperfect, and that's the pyramid structure.
You mentioned that pyramid structure earlier. How is it important? The Egyptian pyramids come to mind because they're so awe-inspiringly beautiful. But in terms of one's spiritual journey, how is the pyramid relevant? Maslow's hierarchy of needs comes to my mind when I think of the pyramid. Do you understand it differently?
No, I think that when you're on a spiritual journey, it's rather similar to going up a mountain, which is sometimes a little bit cone-shaped or pyramid-shaped. And, you know, at the bottom, there's lots of people, and that's the easy level. And as you go further up, I find it's almost like you pass through glass ceilings, and then when you're on the next level, there's not so many people there, and things are different. And whoever's on the layer below, they don't know anything about it, you know, and then maybe you'll go to another layer and another layer. And, you know, there's people, they say, oh, well, it's lonely at the top, so you're going to be lonely if you go up there. And I would say, well, what are you talking about? At the top you have God, so what's the problem? Where did you get that silly phrase from? You know? But you're trying to reach higher and higher levels, and obviously there's going to be less and less people with that sort of spiritual ambition to reach those levels, because a lot of people, they want to be at the base level. And I think, you know, when you start your spiritual practice, you don't know who you are, you don't know whether you're a high or a low or a middle or what, you know. The soul is compared with a battery, and you don't know what voltage you are, so you start charging up, then you see how much charge you can take. And if you're a, you know, high voltage battery, then you'll just keep taking, and that'll put you in that category. And so you're discovering yourself as you move along the way, and that is the way humanity is structured, really. And the idea of equality, which is very much part of the Western tradition, is based on the idea that, well, everybody should have an equal opportunity, everybody equally starts off as a little baby, and so on. But, you know, everywhere else, it's really not equal at all. There's a social hierarchy, there's a hierarchy of intelligence, opportunity, and then, of course, in the world of the East, you bring in the whole question of karma, which makes a huge, big difference. So I think the idea of equality is a nice idea, but the idea of the pyramid corresponds much better to the reality of the nature of humanity, human society. But, you know...
Sorry, Sister Denise, repeat that last line.
The idea of the pyramid corresponds much better to the nature of human society. The thing is, I mean, in ancient times, it's always been very pyramidal in structure. But in more modern times, because people at the top were abusing people at the bottom, the people at the bottom took them out and created a flatter society. But that flat society can't really stay very flat. It tends to restructure itself into some sort of a pyramid structure, but you know, it's less and less functional as time goes on, because there's more and more things that cause it to break down and so on and so forth. But I think that if you want to model yourself on God and on God's creation, you try and get as close as possible to God in terms of all of your characteristics. And, you know, the highest aim would be to make oneself almost equal to God. If everybody's aiming for that, but still you're going to end up, some are closer, some are further away, more are further away and fewer are closer, because it's not at all easy or obvious as to how to become absolutely like God. So even though God is the creator and says, you know, become like me as much as possible, take whatever you can from me, but people will do to their own capacity, according to their own power of desire, power of love. It's very variable.
Yes, Denise, you know, I'm thinking of an individual who, when he or she is at home, has shows his or her family a certain part of their personality. When they go to work, they show their colleagues another part of their personality, which is very different from the one at home. And then when they go to play squash with colleagues, then there's another part of the personality. And then when you're with your elders, there's another part of personality that are all different. If one is to follow such a person throughout the day, you'll see that that person has many different faces, okay? But that's how that person functions. So when faced with such an individual, is all of that real?
No, everybody's like that. And it is real. Where it becomes a problem is where they let only certain people see certain things. So they can be something at home and present themselves at home, but they never allow the home people to go to the office. So those home people never see that other side of the person. So they never know all the sides. You know, a person is a multifaceted diamond. And in the center of that diamond is a sort of a glow, which is the essence of that person. I think the problem lies when you compartmentalize and you do not allow people access to all the different characters that you play. And because then it will be seen that there's something wrong, you've got something to hide.
And there's no transparency in that, is there?
Well, that's what's not transparent. But if you can follow a person in all their various different places, there is going to be an integrity and a coherence between all the different sides of the personality, so they won't have any problem. Or you can see me at work, or you can see me at home, or you can see me in the shower, or you can see me, you know, when I'm mountaineering. I'm still the same person. But if I say, no, you can't follow me to this place or that place, it means, why not? What are you hiding? I mean, there are people who really need their alone time. But if you would go in there, you'd still find the same person. You wouldn't find somebody who's fundamentally different, you know. What happens with compartmentalization is, okay, you have someone at work who's torturing people 9 to 5, and then at home, they're really nice. And these two selves are so opposite. Nobody's ever allowed to see that the same guy who's doing this 9 to 5 has got, you know, and this, there are many examples of this in concentration camps or something like this. And this is where the problem lies. It's Jekyll and Hyde kind of thing.
Yeah. So Denise, the ego causes one to put on many masks. Like you said in a previous episode, this is for self-protection. One cannot be too egotistical and transparent at the same time, can one?
I think that when you're wearing a mask, which is an ego defense mask, that's not the same as putting on a mask to play a role, because you have to play many roles. It's very different. Because the ego defense mask, you're hiding behind it, you're hiding your truth behind it, and you are making it look like that mask is you. So I think in spiritual practice, where you want all the parts of you to be coherent, you can easily put the mask on, take it off, put it on, but the same person is behind the mask all the time. You're not fused with the mask. Ego is where you can't take your mask off.
Okay, so interesting description of ego. Okay, so any last words on the subject of transparency, this highly unusual subject? What would you like to leave the viewers with as a parting shot?
Well, I think that when you come in front of God, that is where your transparency counts, and you want to have nothing that is between you and God. No mask, no filter, no anything. You're just there. Okay, this is me. Take me. It's very special.
Yeah, there are very few who can do that.
Because otherwise people, you know, I don't want you to really see me because, you know, I'm not in a state of integrity.
That's the only safe personality to do that with, isn't it? So,
Yes.
yeah, I can't see possibly being safe to do that with a human being. Okay, on that note, on that high note, thank you. Thank you. It's been extremely educational. There you have it, the subject of transparency. Sister Denise shared that it is necessary to be transparent in certain situations and necessary to be otherwise, in other words, not transparent in other situations. And you have to call upon your own innate wisdom to know which and how to be what in what circumstance. A very interesting subject. I did like the note on which Sister Denise ended today's talk, that it is safe for the human soul to stand before God totally transparent. She used the word naked in a previous episode, not meaning not physically naked, but without one's ego masks, to stand before God and let God do the work on you that He deems necessary. This is what it means to have a true relationship with God. So I do hope that you can use what we shared today and taking your understanding of yourself and the divine further. And I do hope to see you again on next episode. Thank you for joining us, and goodbye.